Hello, everybody. I'm so sorry that I'm talking to you at lunch when I know you want to have engaging conversations with each other. Also, wow, it's quiet now. I was about to do like a camp activity if you can hear me clap once, but it's all good. Are the slides working? The slides might not be working. Is there no slides? I also don't need slides if necessary. It's all good. We're having an update Adobe Flash situation. I love technology. It's my favorite thing in the world. Hey, it's all good.
It's just the.
I don't need to use slides. My slides are basic as hell. So.
There you go.
Okay, there you go. Okay, cool. So, hello everybody. My name is Nasma Ahmed. I'm the director of the Digital Justice Lab, and we're focused on building towards a more just and equitable digital future. It's extremely broad. I know that's part of the sadness of building a mission statement. And really how we do this work is through public education, capacity building, and policy intervention. And really a lot of it is just an experiment. And how we define digital justice is thinking through communication as a human right. The digital justice movement started in Detroit in 2012, and I've been really grateful to be a part of that space. And really part of bringing this work in the Canadian context is having localized conversations about what it looks like for us to be building digital justice here. How does that play into our work? How do we think of justice and equity as a framework in how we build better futures? And so obviously what we imagine for our digital future is connected to our physical reality. We know this, right, in our everyday movements, and especially in the work that most of you are doing in digital transformation. One of the really good examples around the advancements of digital technology and specifically how it ties into transformation of our services is the really good book actually by Virginia Eubanks, Automating Inequality, which talks about the different examples of how public service has transformed. Has anyone read the book? Can you put your hand up if you read the book? Okay, more of you need to read that book. So I'm just suggesting that, just because it provides really core examples of what happens when we are, consumed by the conversation of digital transformation in our services, but specifically thinking about efficiency and the impact of efficiency. I'm also realizing that I sent these slides in last week and most of my ideas have changed. So we're gonna skip through some things. That's my surveillance one. And so part of why I'm here today is really to talk about how do we ground our work in justice and equity, and how do we do that at the lab, and specifically the hard stuff that comes with that. And, really what we're trying to do is imagine better futures together. The hard thing about that is what in the world is our common value in imagining better futures together, because we all have different ideas of what that looks like. And really the hard work comes from having the day-to-day conversations with community partners, from having the conversations with city staffers about really what do we mean when we say public good. And how do we build common values in this work? And to be honest, in most cases, I would love to say I know what the future looks like. I have no idea. And I'd love to say I know what a better future looks like. And once again, absolutely no idea. This is what iteration is all about. And we're constantly iterating and trying to figure out what do we want to see moving forward. And how we have those conversations in many cases is moving at the speed of trust. And moving at the speed of trust means that we move extremely, extremely slow. And sometimes people think that because we're civil society and we're outside of the government bureaucracies that we're somewhat moving faster. And I'd like to say I absolutely am not. Partly because if we want to be building valuable work and we want to be building work that meets people where they're at, we got to move slowly. And we got to fail. So I'm failing all the time. And when I say I'm failing all the time is people assume in many cases that if you're grounded in justice and if you're grounded in equity that, we're living in somewhat of a rosy space, but it actually isn't. I'm failing all the time. So for example, transparency and openness. I suck at that. Why do I suck at that? Because I often don't have the resources and time to be writing out my processes in the public. And so, if you ask me what we do and if you ask me how we do it, I can easily tell you. And, I do have several docs somewhere that can tell you, but in many cases, it's really hard to translate in an online space because sometimes we just don't have the time and we don't have the resources, even if we value openness and transparency, right? or projects that fail or don't even come to life, because in many cases we're a small group that really is trying to have big conversations, and we're not in many ways given the space and leeway to fail. So I fail anyways. Even if we're not given the space by our funders, we try our best to create the open opportunity for failure. And we fail some more. And part of that conversation about failure is recognizing that most of us in our work have an approach, I hope, around do no harm, right? So we're thinking through our work in a space of like, we're trying to not harm. But if we're following the work of Mia Mingus, who's an amazing disability justice organizer, we will cause harm. We'll cause harm in our interpersonal relationships, we'll cause harm in our work situations. Harm will happen, right? So the question here is, how do we think through accountability measures in the process of how we do our work? Because the fear of harm, right, is one piece of the puzzle. But in many cases, it's how do we think through the accountability that we need to do in our work? So part of that is, how do you ensure that, for example, when you're working on a digital project, that the community that you're working with has a process of actually communicating with you if there is harms coming up, right? Or if there are issues coming up. How do you create that feedback loop in the work that you do? And so for us, like, we run privacy workshops for youth in the city, and there are times where we actually don't publicly post anything at all. And part of that is because actually a lot of the youth representatives who come to our workshops don't want kind of some of the content to be shared. And so we have had a process of having those conversations with people who participate in our programs, being really clear and honest about like, what is accountability look like as you partake in this program with us? Because sometimes we're going to fail, and sometimes we might not get things right, but we want to make sure that there is a process there for you. And one of the biggest questions I ask in the work that I do, even if we're talking about the fluffiness of adding equity into our work or having the lens of equity in our work, is, do I really need to be doing this? Is a question I ask myself often, because I think of my work as, so we're in a larger ecosystem, and I think of myself as like a fractal of this larger ecosystem. And our role in this work, my role, the role of others, is trying to figure out how do we best advance this ecosystem that we're in? Obviously, we might not have common values in that, and I think that's what we're all trying to figure out. We might not have a perfect idea of what the future looks like or what we think justice looks like in the future, but how do I do my job very well and understand that I have one role, right? And sometimes that role changes. And I think it's understanding that we are in this ecosystem and we don't have to do absolutely everything. And so for me, a lot of that comes out of our advocacy work. So we don't do a lot of advocacy work. And part of that is because, first of all, we can't really do it super well. And second of all, is that there are other organizations doing it. So we don't have to do it. And instead, we can tag into the work. And so asking the question of, do I really need to do this, is an important piece in how we ensure that what we're doing is actually deep work and not necessarily wide-reaching work. And then, are we grounded in the public good, and how does justice and equity play into that? And so part of that conversation really comes into difficult pieces around how we do our design of our projects. And so in many cases, we don't get those projects funded because, for example, when I have part-time staff members, I want to ensure that if we're doing a larger project, that they actually have access to an additional $100, $150 for insurance, for example, like medical health insurance. Funders hate that. And part of the reason why we do that is because we recognize the part-time staffers that we do have often have other part-time jobs, right? And so even if it's not necessarily in the design of the program, it's even in how we're thinking about hiring people, it's important for us to think about how do we make it as equitable as possible for people to engage. Obviously, the questions about the grounded in the public good is a hard one. It's something that we constantly grapple with, like what in the world is a public good? But I imagine as folks who work in public service, you're thinking about that even more than I am. And so we really, once again, always ask the question yet again, do I really need to be doing this? And is this advancing an agenda for the community that we're working with? Is it advancing an agenda of how we think possibly the world could look like? Because it's important to note that at the Digital Justice Lab, we're not a membership organization, right? So we don't necessarily represent anyone. So we are trying to just have bigger conversations about what it means for us to have a better future, whatever that could look like. And we're really grounded in equity equity-seeking groups, so folks who are Black, brown, Indigenous, folks with disabilities. And so sometimes we don't know what the public good looks like in many cases, and those conversations happen over and over and over again every single month. And one thing that I really constantly think about in my work is, are we rushing and why? This one's really hard in the policy intervention space, is that we're often being rushed in the process. And, if we want to create spaces for folks to be able to actually have meaningful discourse or meaningful conversation about tech policy or like a weird part of privacy law that they've never touched, but then we want to engage people of color and they've never actually touched a specific thing, but we want their opinion on it in 2 weeks. It's a hard one, right? And so a lot of my role in many cases is telling people to slow down. And people hate that, but I'm telling people to slow down because, hey, we're in the situation right now that we're still building the knowledge capacity for folks to meaningfully engage. And let's be honest, even for me, half the artificial intelligence conversations, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know what some of the terms mean. I try to humble myself in what I do not know. And so I think it's important that if we're really thinking about justice, if we're thinking about building better futures and actually building a bigger net of folks who can engage in that conversation, we have to slow down. And slowing down means moving at the speed of trust. Slowing down means, hey, maybe we can't push this thing right now politically, but in 6 months down the line, we can do the hard work now to make it easier for folks to tag in later. And that is hard. It is hard work, and it's hard to tell people to slow down when we're constantly in the sense of urgency. And the sense of urgency, I think, is often false. And so it's important for us to remember, how do we build a wider net for people to engage? And they will not be able to engage if we're constantly asking them to provide their input in 2 weeks. And I know we know this in our work, and I know we try to internalize this in our work, but moving at the speed of trust means moving slow. And allowing for people to actually understand what's going on in the landscape that you're working in. And so a good example of that is there was some work that we were actually going to do, about a year and a half ago, and we actually had to stop it completely because of the political climate, but also because a lot of organizations we were working with were so under-resourced that it did not make sense to add another conversation to the work that they're doing. And guess what? It's okay, and everything's fine, and people are slowly coming into it, and we're going to be able to do the project soon. But, really slowing down to meet people where they're at is an important piece of how we ensure that we're grounding ourselves in values that we care about. And people who've heard me speak before know that this is one of my favorite quotes by Adrienne Maree Brown, but to really transform our society, we will need to make justice one of the most pleasurable experiences we can have. And this is my all-time favorite quote, because we need to have fun doing this work. Right? We're trying to build spaces where people feel included, where people are able to access services in all the ways possible, where people actually feel a sense of social cohesion, as they say. And for that to happen, we need to make this experience pleasurable for ourselves, right? And not just for the people around us. And so a lot of that is through, for us, it's through the arts. We run an arts program with Trinity Square Video, and that's just an exploration of what futures could look like using the arts, right? And just having a lot of fun. For example, a great way that I try to make justice a more pleasurable experience for myself is I don't work past a certain time because I need to be well rested to be able to deal with the next day. And I actually do ceramics, and I do all the millennial things that folks do. So ceramics, scrolling through Instagram, watching way too many YouTube videos, tagging out after 6 p.m. because I don't need to be a martyr for anybody. And part of that is so that I could be a full-fledged human being doing my work. And I can actually be a happier human being doing my work. And so how do we ensure that we're making this a pleasurable experience, not only for the people around us, for people to actually want to think through futures together, but also for ourselves, right? And how do we ensure that we're taking care of ourselves in the process, because we are not martyrs for our work, no matter how hard it is, right? And for us to really be thinking through positive futures, or whatever the future looks like beyond the climate crisis that currently exists, it's important for us to be able to actually have the time, space, and brain capacity to be able to do that. And that starts with working on yourself and being able to take care of yourself in the process. So thank you so much for listening while you eat. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. And if you need any self-care tips or my favorite YouTube channels, I'll definitely share it with you later. So thank you so much.